Okay, so games need good enemies to be fun, right? I guess that's a bit of a broad statement, but you know what I mean. Games with an emphasis on combat need to actually have combatants that are fun to fight. Otherwise, what's the point? If all the player has is a bunch of fancy tools and weapons, but nothing to use them on, the game will feel like a shooting gallery more than anything. In my still untitled game project... Wait! This project might finally be past the silly placeholder name phase, as I think I've finally settled on Cathode as the name for the game. Get it? Because cat? Anyway, in the first 2 builds of Cathode, the only enemy in the game was this thing called a Magnetron, which is more of a static hazard than an enemy. It just hovers there, menacingly staring at you, and shocking you if you touch its electromagnetic field. But that's about it. From a game design perspective, the point of this enemy is to teach the player how taking damage works, and ideally also how they can heal. Both necessary pieces of knowledge needed to face more threatening foes. It's also supposed to aid in teaching players that they can slide under things, something that the first level tries to hammer home, alongside many other movement abilities that the player has access to. But that's pretty much it. As soon as you loot the first weapon, the machine pistol, from an empty warehouse, the Magnetrons lose nearly all of the little risk factor they had. So it's pretty clear that there was a need for something that actually fights back. If you've watched the previous devlog in this series, you'll know that encouraging the player to shoot while they rail grind, which is the central movement mechanic in Cathode that everything else is based around, is a huge goal for the upcoming parts of the game. Now that the player is acquainted with the movement, it's time for them to properly get used to how shooting works, and to learn how it combines with the rail grinding and other parkour moves. I decided a good way to go about this would be to design an enemy that shoots predictable but still dangerous projectiles that explode on contact with anything. The player would be able to combat the projectile in a number of ways, by dodging it, by shooting it down, and also via another really cool move that I'll talk about later in this video. Because dodging projectiles would completely change the flow and feel of parkouring around, I decided to make that the enemy's main ability, and keep it incredibly simple otherwise. We want to slowly ease the player into unfamiliar waters, like the inclusion of actively hostile enemies, and not overwhelm them with complicated and potentially confusing behaviors. I've noticed that a lot of games follow this design pattern with their enemies. Each enemy by itself is fairly predictable and only has 1 or 2 actions that it can generally perform. This makes them easy to dispatch by themselves, or when there's a group of the same enemy type. What makes combat challenging and extra engaging is when there are multiple enemies of different types, and their attack patterns start overlapping in unique ways. I think this might be as common as it is because it makes combat feel a lot fairer. It's a lot easier to mentally manage the capabilities of each foe, and they're also a lot less likely to pull some random move out of their ass that you forgot they have. This means that juggling multiple overlapping attack patterns becomes a lot more doable without taking Adderall. From a developer perspective, it also makes it easier to control exactly how complicated each combat encounter will be. This is one of those things that I feel like once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Many games seem to design their enemies in this way, including but not limited to pretty much every roguelike game on the planet. This design pattern is something I'm seeking to emulate in Cathode. The 3 enemies I've made so far each follow it, with simple, predictable behaviors. They aren't yet super complicated when combined, at least not yet, but we're still in the early game in terms of meta progression, so it's good to give the player time to digest everything before we properly start ramping up the complexity. Without further ado, enter the first enemy I've created since build 2, the missile turret. This aptly named contraption is an immobile fortification that launches rockets at the player once it sees them. The rockets launch at a fairly slow speed, but quickly accelerate, making them dodgeable but still threatening at all ranges. The attack also has a very prominent wind-up animation, which is something that I'll be reusing for all future enemies with explicit attacks like the missile. This lets the player know that something's about to attack them, even if they aren't looking at it, thanks to the sound effect. In the work-in-progress version of the second level, I've made sure to include a couple of encounters that strongly encourage, if not outright require, the player to shoot while they grind, lest their next meal be a missile to the face. This is also reinforced by the turret's near inability to actually hit you while you're grinding or sliding, because of how fast you go, which can feel pretty awesome when you blow through a room of turrets while none of them have even the slimmest chance of ever hitting you. This is absolutely a note that I want to hit with my enemy designs, since I feel like going fast is going to be one of the big appeals of this game. Having enemies helplessly try to stop you but fail because of just how fast you are certainly adds to that feeling. Despite its simplicity, I honestly think I've cooked with the missile turret. Even just a simple scenario with some cover, grind rails, and turrets can easily be an engaging combat encounter, which gives me a decent amount of confidence in this enemy. Of course, it's all going to need plenty of playtesting to tell if it's actually good, as with most things. As of the time of this video's release, I'm not quite ready for the third round of playtesting, but it's definitely on the horizon, and I'll be posting both a YouTube short to announce it as I've done in the past, as well as by making an announcement in my Discord server. The playtesting will be open to everyone, as I will want to get as many fresh perspectives as I can from people who haven't played the previous builds before. So stay tuned if that's something you'd want to help out with. The second enemy that I've created is a bit more unique than the turret. I wanted to learn pathfinding and AI navigation, as well as behavior trees, which is the solution I've used to create both the turret and the next enemy's decision-making AIs. I thought up an enemy design that would make use of both of these systems, while not being too complex or too similar in function to the missile turret, to keep things fresh and interesting. From this, I ended up making the Constructor, a little propeller drone that's completely passive and cannot directly harm the player. What it can do is construct, as per the name. So far, I can build both Magnetrons and missile turrets at predefined locations in each map, a list to which I'll also add any future fortification-themed enemies I end up creating. These enemies, when killed, will create another hardpoint, or place where they can be built, which gives the Constructor the illusion of trying to rebuild turrets and magnets you've destroyed. The Constructor wasn't something I was 100% confident in from the start. I was actually quite skeptical of the idea, because for some reason I had this preconception in my head that everyone hates summoner-type enemies in games. I have no idea where I got this idea from, but it worried me so much that I created a YouTube short to kind of test the waters, and see what people's gut reactions towards this type of foe would be. And it turns out that most people don't actually care. It definitely depends on the enemy and the specifics of how it's implemented, but people definitely don't hate this type of enemy out of the box. This knowledge inspired me to go forward with creating the Constructor enemy according to my initial idea. And because I was so worried about people hating it, I gave it pretty much every weakness in the book. It was incredibly slow moving around the map. The construction sequence for a new enemy was quite long and could be cancelled by shooting the hologram. And of course, it was incredibly weak, only having half the health value of a Magnetron. These weaknesses combined, unsurprisingly, to make it pretty much useless. It would almost never get a construction job finished, even if there were multiple constructors building different enemies at once, because the player would kill them all too fast. So I changed one thing. I made it really fast. Every other weakness remains even now, but the drones can now actually move between construction targets quickly. And with this one change, I think the enemy's in a pretty good spot. It's still easily counterable in combat, but it actually requires dealing with, because it can now make it to its first construction target before getting shot out of the sky. And don't forget, in Cathode, dealing with an enemy doesn't strictly mean killing it. There's never anything stopping you from just leaving a combat encounter. One of my design goals for this game is to never impede the player's speed and movement through a level. The only limiting factor for how quickly they can traverse it should be their skill. That means no puzzles, no cutscenes, and absolutely no obligatory combat encounters. This is definitely a strength of the game, as it feels pretty dang fun to absolutely blast past a squad of enemies, and for there to be pretty much nothing they can do to stop you getting away. It really reinforces that feeling of being on the run that I want to hammer home with the movement and level design. With that said, in the future I do want to include some enemies that are a bit more disruptive to the gameplay loop, like a bot that tries to get in front of you and block your movements, or one that pursues you, grinding on rails to catch up to you. But that kind of stuff will have to come later, after we've ensured the player has gotten used to the movement and combat enough that we can start ramping things up difficulty-wise. If you're interested in this project, Cathode, and want to help support it, I do have a page on one of the rewards for supporting are exclusive mini devlogs. There are currently 2 available to view on here. These are intended for people who are extra interested in this project and want to hear about my progress on a more regular basis. They're minimally edited, short yap sessions that come out roughly once every 2 weeks. So far, they've ended up being about 20 minutes each. Okay, maybe mini devlog isn't the most appropriate name, but anyway. The next mini log will be coming out shortly after this video, and will delve into a major level gimmick that every level after the first will have. Something that I'll eventually cover in a YouTube video, but since it's still a massive work in progress, Patreon supporters will be the first to hear about it. There are also a bunch of other rewards, like having your name shown in these videos, and getting to see them a few days earlier than everyone else. A huge thanks to everyone who's supported so far, it really means a lot, and I'm very excited to keep working on this project and to make it the best version of itself. To create the decision-making AI for my enemies, I've been using the Unity Behaviour package, which is a way to create what they call behaviour graphs, not behaviour trees, emphasizing their ability to have logic that loops back on itself and is generally more flexible than a tree. I've had some minor issues with this package, but they're honestly mostly to do with the incomplete documentation, which does make figuring out exactly how some nodes work a bit tricky. Although, since it's a package, the built-in nodes code is viewable, which does help. But aside from that, I've had a fantastic time with this asset. Having a built-in way to create nice, clean, visual representations of the enemy's AI state makes iterating on the behavior nice and smooth, as well as allowing for easier debugging. As you can see, the behavior graphs for both the enemies are actually quite simple, as the functionality is condensed into actions, which are just little scripts that are designed to be reusable between different graphs. And also the enemy designs are just simple. I've tried my best throughout the enemy designing process to make my code as modular and reusable as possible to help future enemy creation be a lot smoother. For example, the sightline script that determines whether or not an enemy can see the player is generic, and I can easily chuck it onto pretty much anything to get a sightline status on a given target. This also means that enemies don't have a master script or one huge code file that handles all the logic, which makes managing things much less of a headache. The turret's AI is quite simple, but lends itself to a surprising number of interesting scenarios. An example is if the turret's AI loses sight of the player, it will try to find nearby destructible props to shoot instead, and if it can't find any cover, it'll finish its current attack aiming at the player's last known location, but after that goes back to being inactive. I use this to create a really fun encounter with a couple of turrets in a warehouse full of wooden boxes. The player drops in from above, falls down and lands stuck behind some wooden crates, but since the turret saw them fall, their cover-destroying behavior kicks in, freeing the player from their wooden prison. Then you have to make your way through the warehouse, carefully avoiding turret fire as they keep blowing up your cover. It isn't a perfect encounter since it hasn't been playtested yet, but I think it's exciting and definitely a fun use of this behavior. Creating interesting fights with the constructor drone has proven to be a bit trickier. I can't simply slap them in a room and call it a day. It takes a bit more work to make an enjoyable matchup, but when done right, they are quite an interesting foe to deal with. My favorite encounter with the drones so far involves one trying to build a Magnetron right in front of you. You can ignore it and speed past or shoot down the drone. Either way, you'll drop down onto the straight bit of terrain, where another pair of constructors see you and hastily start building some missile turrets to shoot you down. Then it's kind of like a race to get close enough to the drones to blow them up, cancel their builds, or just ignore them completely and whiz past at the speed of sound before they can finish constructing the turrets. I like this encounter a lot, but I realize that I've accidentally created it, or at least other encounters that are very similar to it, multiple times, while trying to experiment with the constructor during level design. So I'm still finding it a bit tricky to create exciting appearances of this enemy, but I'm getting there. It's just going to take a bit longer than with the turret. With that said, some of the constructor combats I've made so far are quite thrilling, which does give me some level of confidence. So remember the other way to counter the missile turrets that I mentioned before? I wanted to add some way to reflect the missile back at the turret that shot it, mostly because it's cool, but also as a way to counter the turret if, say, your gun's out of ammo. Lots of games have a parry move, but I didn't want to simply add a parry button like other games often have. I'm pretty happy with the control scheme so far, and since parrying isn't a core part of the combat, and is more like a fun extra thing you can occasionally pull off for some extra style points, it doesn't really need a prominent dedicated button. So what I did instead was integrate it into an existing move. The slide. I already wanted to add a slide kick, which basically means that sliding into things damages them, and the parry fit right in. Add a cool sound effect, some juice, and you get this. I like my interpretation of the parry a lot. Because in Cathode you can only slide from a grind, the parry is recontextualized as a situation-specific stylistic move, instead of a more bread-and-butter ability you can use / spam whenever. This aligns brilliantly with the goals for the game that I've talked about in previous devlogs. Admittedly, the practical applications of the parry are a bit limited. It's super situational, and most of the time, simply shooting the enemy with your gun is more effective, although nowhere near as cool. Despite its potential lack of usefulness, I think it'd be a lot of fun to not actually teach the parry to the player, and keep it as one of those secret mechanics that they can discover themselves or learn about via osmosis, because I really love when games do that. The most I do is design some encounters that are intended to make the player accidentally parry a missile, and maybe they'll figure it out from there. Or maybe not. To wrap up this video, I wanted to briefly go over some other enemy ideas that I've had. Feel free to vote on your favorite one or to give your own ideas. The strongest concept I have at the moment is for a mortar turret that would act as an area denial enemy by bombarding areas near the player. Areas with an incoming projectile would be marked, so you could easily avoid them, but they would be effectively blocked off by the threat of taking damage, which could encourage players to find different, safer paths through the environment, or to simply risk it and bomb straight through anyway. Additionally, I thought the enemy could have a sort of puzzle element to it. Since it could bombard you from a distance while being out of sight, it could make for some interesting scenarios where you have to climb a building and destroy the mortar turrets hidden on the roof before you can safely proceed, or something like that. I like this concept a lot, but for my third enemy, I wanted to experiment with a drastically different mobile enemy and not just to make another turret, but I'll definitely be bookmarking the mortar turret as a possibility for the future. The smart bot is another strong concept that I have, and it would basically be the pursuing enemy that I talked about before, that follows you and can grind on rails to catch up. It would only have melee attacks, but it would, terrifyingly enough, be faster than you while it's grinding. This could create some fun scenarios where you're being chased after by a bunch of smart bots on a really long rail, and must spin around and shoot behind you to get rid of them, or jump over them as they approach, or something like that. Those are the most fleshed out ideas that I have. As I work on more levels and introduce more mechanics, new needs for foes will arise, like they did with the missile turret and the need to encourage the player to move and shoot at the same time. But for now, the 2 new enemies will need plenty of playtesting and refining before it's time to make more. Like I mentioned before, the 3rd round of playtesting is on the horizon. And if you want to participate, my Discord server and my YouTube Shorts feed are where you can find out about it as soon as I'm ready to start the tests. Thanks again to my Cathode Child supporters. Hey, that name makes sense now. Enderbreath12, Earl Monsfield Erno, and Mercati. I'm honestly blown away on the support for the Cathode Child and Patreon tier. The tier is limited to 3 supporters for now, because I'm not quite up to implementing the unique to you personalized rewards into the game. Once I reach this stage, I'll increase the limit of this tier, but until then it will most likely stay sold out. You can still support at the Hardlight tier to view the mini devlogs, the next one of which will be coming out shortly after this video, and will delve into that super cool level gimmick I mentioned before. Anyway, thanks for watching. This is pretty much all I have planned for this video. If you want to learn more about this project, I've made 2 other devlogs about Cathode in the past that you can watch right now. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.